Welcome back. In this lecture, we will be giving a bird's eye view of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. It asks the question, what counts as knowledge? Now, one question worth considering is why we even need to turn our attention to epistemology in the first place. What's the point? If we recall, the goal in these lectures is to grasp what philosophy is and why anyone would dedicate their lives to study it. We also may recall that in our study of philosophy, there are three things we need to focus on. First, the object of study. Second, the subject who studies. And third, the activity we engage in as we do philosophy. Now, philosophy, as we have mentioned previously, is the love of wisdom. And love is not some static thing. Love is not even merely an action. Love is an activity, a kind of doing. To understand philosophy, then, we have to understand the activities we engage in as we do philosophy. And since loving and knowing are both activities, we have to understand in what sense loving and knowing are related. There is a 17th century mathematician and philosopher named Blaise Pascal. You might know of him if you have heard of, say, Pascal's wager, or from algebra when studying Pascal's triangle. Pascal tells us that the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing of. Love is a kind of knowing. So if we want to understand the activity of philosophy, which is to love, and if loving is a kind of knowing, then we must know what it means to know. Otherwise, we will not be able to grasp what philosophy is, or why we would even bother dedicating our lives to it. Now, of course, even though we are still at the beginning of the lecture, we might object that perhaps it is not worth grasping what philosophy is, and that we don't need to bother with knowing why anyone would dedicate their lives to it. But consider what this objection assumes. It assumes that philosophy is not worth doing. Yet in giving this objection, the objector is already engaged in philosophical activity. To say that philosophy is not worth understanding is itself a philosophical position. But if it is a philosophical position that one refuses to understand, then it is a position that is not conscious of itself. It is not reflective. And since, as we've learned from Aristotle, we might understand human beings to be rational animals, or animals capable of reflective, conscious thought, the claim that philosophy is unnecessary assumes that man is not a rational animal, and this is an irrational position. So the question is not whether philosophy is worth pursuing. Everyone engages in philosophical activity, whether they know it or not. Rather, the question is how well we will philosophize. Earlier, we said that epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. But what does this mean? We seem to know quite a few things. For example, we seem to know that we exist, that mathematical statements like 2 + 2 = 4 are true. We know that we are listening to this lecture. Everyone seems to know things. Of course, someone could say that we don't know anything, but we only have to ask, do you know that? If yes, then the person does know something, and his or her statement contradicts what he knows. If the person says, no, I don't know that we don't know things, then the person can't say it's true that we don't know things. So either way, we can know things. But epistemology takes this question a step further. Given that we can know things, what does it mean to know? How do we know what we know? What forms or constitutes knowledge? There has been a long-standing tradition, going back to Plato, that knowledge is defined as justified, true belief. Whatever we know, we believe. We trust it. But we don't trust it to be false, we trust it to be true. And not only do we trust something to be true, we trust it to be true for a reason. we can state what we believe and give the reasons for why our beliefs are true. And if the reasons are good, if they sufficiently answer the question why, then the belief is justified. If the reasons are bad and do not sufficiently answer the question why, then the belief is unjustified and not known to be true. So knowledge, since the time of Plato, has often been understood as justified true belief. Now, this definition of knowledge as justified true belief was the standard view for centuries. Philosophers from the ancient world through the early modern period generally accepted that if you believed something, if it was true, and if you had good reasons for believing it, then you had knowledge. But in the 20th century, a philosopher named Edmund Gettier challenged this definition. He introduced what we now call the Gettier problem. His argument was simple. You can have a belief that is true, and even justified, yet still be right only by accident. And if we are right only by accident, then we should hesitate to call that knowledge. Here's one of his examples. Imagine two people, say Smith and Jones, who are applying for the same job. Smith has very good evidence that Jones will get the job. The boss told him this. Smith also saw Jones empty his pockets and counted 10 coins. So Smith forms the following belief. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. His belief is justified. But it turns out Jones did not get the job. Instead, Smith does. And Smith, without realizing it, also has 10 coins in his pocket. So Smith's belief is true, his belief is true, and it was justified, but it was true only by coincidence. It feels strange to say that Smith knew this. Gettier's point is that justified true belief is not enough for knowledge. A belief can be justified and true, yet still fall short of knowledge if the truth of the belief is accidental. This created a major problem for epistemology, because the definition that had been accepted for centuries suddenly seemed incomplete. Now, some philosophers have pointed out something interesting about this example. When Smith forms the belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, he does not mean any man. Smith means Jones. His belief is specifically about Jones, based on evidence about Jones. So even though the sentence can be reinterpreted in a way that makes it come out true, because Smith himself ends up having 10 coins, that's just not what Smith meant. The belief in his mind was, Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins. And that belief is false. So what Gettier calls a case of justified true belief seems, according to these thinkers, to be actually a case of justified false belief. The only reason the sentence can be read as true is because we may interpret it after the fact in a way that Smith never intended. But knowledge is not just a string of words. Knowledge is about what a person actually means when he or she forms a belief. And if we pay attention to that, it seems that this example is not really a counterexample to the justified true belief model at all. Now, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with Gettier's critique of the definition of knowledge as justified true belief, the discussion on what is knowledge sheds light on a few truths that sometimes go unnoticed. The term knowledge can refer to different things. For example, we sometimes use the term knowledge when we understand what something is. We also use the term knowledge in reference to judgments we make, judging something to be true or false. We also say we know something when we know why that thing is true or false. And this knowledge is a knowledge pertaining to reasoning. This is knowledge in reasoning. And so when we refer to knowledge as justified true belief, we are using the term knowledge to refer to judgments, knowing that something is either true or false. So a judgment then is a proposition, it's a statement that is either true or false. But there's more to judgment than this. I would like us to take a look at 4 different characteristics of judgment, because if we can grasp what a judgment is, we can better grasp what knowledge is. The first characteristic of judgment is this. Judgment takes a proposition, a statement that can be either true or false, and transforms that proposition from an idea, an object of thought, into an object of knowledge, something that can be affirmed or denied. Now, this might sound confusing, so let's consider an example. While listening to this lecture, you may have noticed that some statements make sense to you. You judge them to be true. You might also disagree with some things. You judge those parts to be false. But there might also be parts that are just a bit confusing. You aren't sure whether they are true or false. Those last parts, the ones you're still trying to understand or figure out, are objects of thought. They are ideas in your mind, ideas that could be affirmed as true or denied as false. But if you're confused or still trying to figure things out, you aren't affirming or denying anything yet pertaining to those statements. Those statements remain to be ideas until you are able to judge whether they are true or false. And once you are able to judge whether they are true or false, then you are forming a judgment. So a judgment transforms a proposition from an idea into something you can affirm or deny, into an object of knowledge. That's the first characteristic. The second characteristic is that judgment answers the question, is this true? Everyone in the debate about Gettier, both those who accept his critique and those who reject it, agrees on this much, that knowledge must be of what is true. We can't say we know something if what we know is false. A child who says, I know what 5 plus 5 is, it's 11. A child who says that does not have knowledge. He's simply mistaken. So knowledge must be of what is true. If knowledge must be of what is true, then whenever we try to know something, the question we have to ask is this true? And this question can only be answered in a few ways. We can say, yes, this is true, or no, this is not true. We can also qualify our answers. For example, we might say, this is true in this respect, but false in this other respect, in this other sense. So in short, judgment is the act that answers the question, is this true? It does so in the basic yes or no fashion, even if our yes or no sometimes comes with qualifications. The third characteristic of judgment is that judgment is a fruit of being rational. It requires that we grasp the essential reasons for affirming something as true or denying something as false. For example, if I think that, let's say, capital punishment is a good thing, but I do not understand the essential components of capital punishment, then I am not yet in a position to affirm that capital punishment is good. There are important factors I would need to consider to make a good judgment. If I ignore those factors or don't take those factors into account, then I cannot be said to have made a good, rational judgment. I am making a misjudgment. I might still be right. Maybe capital punishment is a good thing. But that wouldn't count as knowledge because I have not yet considered the reasons that would justify the judgment. This is what we would call a rash judgment. Now, on the flip side, suppose I have all the essential reasons for believing that something is true. For example, I have all the essential reasons for believing that 5 plus 5 is 10. If I have all the reasons I need to affirm that this is true, but I still choose not to affirm it, then I am not acting rationally. I am acting against reason, because I have everything I need to make the judgment, yet I still refuse to make it. So the third characteristic of judgment is that making good, adequate judgments depends on whether we have enough evidence or reasons to make the judgment. That's the third characteristic. Now, the final fourth characteristic is that judgment is something personal. In order for there to be judgments, there has to be someone making the judgment, and that someone is you and me. The fact that we make judgments tells us something about ourselves. It tells us that we are rational beings who can discern between what's true and what's false, and beings who can understand what things are and even ask questions. Since judgment is something personal, it carries a kind of responsibility with it. The responsibility to judge well. That responsibility to judge well is on us as individuals. Now that we've taken some time to understand what a judgment is and what knowledge involves, I want to give a quick overview of what to expect in epistemology. The subject of epistemology is largely an early modern development. The ancient and medieval world certainly had views about how we come to know things, but they did not treat the theory of knowledge as a separate, standalone subject. The first time we see epistemology taken up as a pure subject of study is with the philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. Descartes tries to rebuild knowledge from the ground up. He asks a quite radical question. What can I know with absolute certainty? To answer this, he uses what we call the method of doubt, pushing doubt as far as it can go in order to show that there must be an end to all doubting. His goal is to find something absolutely certain that can't be doubted, and then build all of our knowledge on that foundation. But what Descartes did was revolutionary. His approach split later philosophers into two major camps, the rationalists and the empiricists. Descartes is commonly placed in the rationalist camp. The empiricists agree with Descartes that we should study how we come to know what we know, that we should study epistemology. But they disagree with how he does epistemology. They argue that all of our knowledge begins with experience, that all of our ideas find their origin in what we sense. Now, this doesn't mean that every idea is about something we sense, or at least it doesn't mean that necessarily, but that the starting point of our thinking is always grounded in experience. After we work through the empiricists, we will briefly meet Immanuel Kant. Kant sees the division Descartes created between rationalists and empiricists, those who think knowledge ultimately begins in reason versus those who think it begins in the senses. Kant believes that these two schools of thought can be brought together. And the way he attempts to do this is nothing short of, again, revolutionary. Now, of course, whether he succeeds is something each of us will have the responsibility to judge. Now, of course, I am only skimming over these thinkers here. We will explore them in much more detail. But this overview is meant to show that epistemology, as a subject, is itself revolutionary, and it has been the source of deep disagreement. And the fact that there is so much disagreement here suggests that the truth is probably mixed with falsehoods. So it belongs to us, as the ones who judge, to discern what is true. We have that responsibility because, as rational beings, we are creatures who can reason, judge, understand, question, and experience. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.